Like the skull, the vertebral column is also part of the axial skeleton, and it is the structure that is sometimes referred to as the spine. It has a function in that it helps to protect the spinal cord, and it also allows for muscles to attach. And so it allows for lots of movements. So like flexion of the spine, extension of the spine, rotation of the spine, right? So we have lots of movement between the vertebrae. So in our vertebral column, we have four major parts to the vertebral column. So we have the cervical part, and this cervical part is in the, so the cervical vertebrae, this is in the neck. And there are two very special vertebrae that are found articulating with the skull, which include C1, which is called the atlas, and C2, which is called the axis. So the atlas, you can think about the god holding the world in his hand. So this is holding up your cranium. The axis has a little tooth-like structure which allows our head to turn. And so that is why it is referred to as the axis. So if we look at the cervical vertebrae, you'll notice that there are 7 of them. C1 and C2 look like this. So this is C1, this is the atlas, and C2 is the axis. And they kind of fit together and they allow for rotation of the head. So when we look at the cervical vertebrae, we can remember how many there are because of the times of the day when we typically eat. And so there are actually C1 through C7. So think about 7 o'clock in the morning, you eat breakfast. Then we have the thoracic vertebrae. And these are actually the ones that connect the ribs to the ribs. So this is your mid spine. And how many are there? We eat lunch at noon. So there's like T1 through T12. So there's 12 thoracic vertebrae. Then we have, from the thoracic vertebrae, we have the lumbar vertebrae. And it's kind of interesting as we go down, we have more weight bearing on these vertebrae. And so they actually get larger. So the lumbar vertebrae are much larger, say, than the cervical vertebrae. So the lumbar vertebrae is L1 through L5. So 5 o'clock, we have dinner. And then we have the sacrum and the tailbone, which is the coccyx. So that is part of the vertebral column. The sacrum, which we're going to talk about when we get to the pelvic girdle, connects our pelvic girdle, which connects to our hind limbs, our lower legs, and it is going to connect to the lumbar vertebrae. Okay, so let's look at a diagram of these. So again, these are numbered. They also, interestingly, if we look at the development of our curves, our curves in our spine, natural curvature is super important. When we don't have natural curvature, we can have damage to the spine and damage to our spinal cord. So when we look at the single curve of the fetus, right? So that would be fetal position. When we look at the development of the curves in the adults, we have these 4 different curves. And so this is sometimes referred to as a concave. This is convex. This is concave, and then this is convex. And so you don't need to know that, but the natural curvature is important. So you might know that sometimes the spine in people curves side to side, and that curvature is referred to as scoliosis. And sometimes people actually have to have braces put on their body and maybe even surgically implanted to straighten their spine back up to the way that it is supposed to be. Okay, so we have the thoracic vertebrae, and then we have the lumbar vertebrae, and then we have the sacrum. And then at the very end, we have the coccyx. You'll notice that the sacrum is actually composed of fused vertebrae. The coccyx would be your tailbone. When we look at cervical vertebrae and other vertebrae, you'll notice that there is a vertebral foramen. So this is the hole in the middle of the vertebrae. What does that do? That actually allows for the spinal cord to travel through that space, and that is protected by the vertebral arch. You might also hear, associated with the vertebral column, what is referred to as facet joints. And so as the vertebrae sit one atop the other, they have these joints, which are synovial joints, which we'll talk about different types of joints, but they're flat surfaces. And these joints sometimes can become damaged, specifically as we age, and you have problems with your facet joints. So if you go to a chiropractor and he says your facet joints are inflamed, or there's like bone spurs on your facet joints, that is typical of aging spine. We also have transverse processes coming off of the vertebrae. So these just allow for the attachment of muscles that in some instances allow us to be upright, so help to extend the spine so that we can stay in an upright position. This diagram is really interesting because it does show the spinal cord traveling through the vertebral foramen. This is in the thoracic spine. So here we have the vertebrae traveling through. This is where we're going to have the ribs attached to the thoracic vertebrae. And then in between the vertebrae, the bodies of the vertebrae, we have these intervertebral discs. So intervertebral discs are fibrocartilage, and this fibrocartilage can sometimes be squished and damaged. And so if you've heard of somebody having a herniated disc, that is what they're referring to. They're referring to these cartilaginous discs that are found between the vertebrae right here. And you can notice that there's a lot of compression right down on these discs as we stand upright. And this compression can over time cause the discs to degenerate. And sometimes people have to have surgery because of the degeneration of the discs.